Hey everyone, welcome back to Creepy N. So today's video is definitely going to creep you out. In this video, we're getting into 4 deeply unsettling true stories that happened in the Appalachian Mountains. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. If you enjoy this kind of content, make sure to like the video and subscribe. Alright, let's get into tonight's stories. I was 29 when I took that job with the Forestry Service in eastern Kentucky. It was supposed to be temporary, just something to pay off debt while I figured out what I actually wanted to do with my life. The work was simple enough. Drive out to designated checkpoints, document trail conditions, check for storm damage, report back. Most days I'd see maybe 2 or 3 other people, usually other rangers or the occasional serious hiker. The station gave me an old film camera to document erosion and fallen trees. Digital was standard by then, but our supervisor insisted film held up better in court if there were ever liability issues. I didn't care. It was easy work, and I got to be outside. 3 weeks in, I was assigned a section near Blackwater Ridge, about 15 miles from the nearest town. The trails there were old, some dating back to the logging days. Most had been reclaimed by the forest, but a few were still maintained for the dedicated hikers who wanted isolation. I parked at the access road around 8 in the morning and started the loop. It was supposed to take about 6 hours. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, and the leaves were just starting to turn. I took photos of a collapsed footbridge, some problematic root systems, and the few trail markers that needed replacing. Around noon, I stopped to eat lunch near an old stone foundation, probably from a hunting cabin that burned down decades ago. I was halfway through a sandwich when I noticed the camera sitting on my pack was open. The back panel was unlatched. I knew I closed it. I always closed it. I checked the film counter. It had advanced 3 frames since I'd last used it. I sat there for a long time looking around. There was no one, no sound except wind and the occasional bird. I convinced myself I'd bumped it somehow, maybe when I'd set the pack down. I finished the route and drove back to the station. When I dropped off the film for processing, I didn't mention anything. 2 days later, the developed photos came back in a manila envelope. Most of them were exactly what I'd shot. The bridge, the roots, the trail markers. Then I got to frame 17. It was me, sitting on that stone foundation, eating my sandwich. Taken from about 20 feet away, from behind a tree. You could see part of the trunk in the frame, like whoever took it was hiding. The angle was slightly elevated, like they'd been standing on something, or maybe just taller than average. I checked frame 18, same location, but closer. Maybe 10 feet away now. I was still eating, completely unaware. You could see the side of my face clearly. Frame 19 was taken from directly behind me, close enough that if I'd turned around, I would have seen them. I reported it, filled out paperwork, talked to my supervisor, even filed something with the local sheriff. They sent someone out to walk the area. Found nothing. No footprints, no camps, no evidence anyone had been there. The sheriff suggested maybe another ranger was playing a prank, but I checked the logs. No one else was assigned to that section that day. I kept working, but I started carrying something extra in my pack. I also started checking behind me constantly, every few minutes, just turning around and scanning the trees. It made the hikes longer. About a month later, I was assigned the same section. Different trail, but same general area. I almost called in sick, but I needed the paycheck. I went, I took my photos, documented what I needed to, and kept moving. I didn't stop for lunch. When I got back and developed the film, there were 2 extra frames again. The first was me walking, taken from the side, maybe 30 feet into the tree line. The second was closer, much closer, close enough to see the texture of my jacket. I quit the next day, didn't give 2 weeks, didn't ask for a reference. I just left. About a year later, I ran into my old supervisor at a gas station. We made small talk, and eventually I asked if anyone else had reported anything strange on that section of trail. He got quiet for a second, then said they'd stopped assigning solo rangers to Blackwater Ridge after they found a camera hanging from a tree branch. It was a newer digital model, not like the old film ones we used. It had been there for months based on the weathering. When they checked the memory card, it was full. Hundreds of photos. All of them were rangers, hikers, even a few hunters, all taken without anyone knowing, all from behind trees or elevated positions. The last photo on the card was of a young woman sitting by a stream eating an apple. They never identified her. She'd never checked in at any station, and no missing persons reports matched her description. I didn't ask anything else. I paid for my gas and left. I worked night maintenance at a hospital in Asheville from 2019 to 2021. The job was straightforward. Show up at 11 p.m., handle any repair calls, check equipment, make sure everything was running smoothly, and leave at 7 a.m. when the day crew arrived. The pay was decent, and more importantly, I didn't have to deal with many people. The hospital was old, built in the 1960s, with additions tacked on over the decades. It created this maze of hallways, some used daily, others forgotten, except for storage or mechanical access. My supervisor gave me a master key card and a basic map on my first day, then mostly left me alone. Most nights were quiet. I'd replace light bulbs, fix dripping faucets, reset breakers, occasionally help move equipment. Around 3 a.m., I'd take my break in the cafeteria, eat whatever I'd brought, and scroll through my phone until it was time to make another round. The fourth floor was the oldest section. It used to be the psychiatric ward before they built the new behavioral health building in the 90s. Now it was mostly administrative offices and storage. During the day it was busy enough, but at night it was completely empty. The lights were on timers, so half the hallways would be dark unless you hit the manual override. 3 months into the job, I got a call around 2 a.m. to check a water pressure issue on the 4th floor. One of the nurses on the floor below said she could hear pipes rattling. I grabbed my tools and headed up. The elevator opened to a dark hallway. I hit the light switch and the fluorescents flickered on with that buzzing hum they make when they're old. I followed the sound of the rattling to a maintenance closet near the east wing. The problem was simple. A shut-off valve hadn't been fully opened after some previous work. I adjusted it and the rattling stopped. I was about to leave when I noticed the door at the end of the hallway was propped open with a doorstop. That door was always locked. It led to the old ward section, which had been closed off for years. Asbestos abatement or something. I walked over and looked inside. The lights were off, but I could see the hallway extended about 50 feet before turning. There was a smell, not strong but noticeable. Mildew and something else, something stale. I removed the doorstop and pulled the door shut. It locked automatically. I went back downstairs and finished my shift. The next night, same thing. I came up to replace a light bulb in one of the offices, and the door was propped open again. Same doorstop. Same smell coming from inside. I closed it again, and this time I checked with the day shift supervisor in the morning. He said no one had been up there in weeks. I started checking that door every night during my rounds. For about a week, it stayed closed. Then one night I came up, and it was open again. But this time the doorstop was on the inside, like someone had walked through and propped it from the other side. I stood there for a long time, deciding what to do. I finally pulled out my flashlight and stepped inside. The hallway was exactly as I remembered from the quick glance before. Old linoleum tiles, peeling paint, doors lining both sides. I walked slowly, checking each door as I passed. All locked. I reached the turn and stopped. There was a wheelchair sitting in the middle of the hallway, facing away from me. It was old, probably from when the ward was still active. The vinyl seat was cracked, and one of the wheels was missing its rubber. I walked around it and kept going. The hallway ended at a nurse's station, just a desk behind a half wall with a sliding window. There was a clipboard hanging on the wall, the paper yellowed and brittle. I got close enough to see it was a patient check-in sheet from 1987. That's when I heard the wheelchair move. Not rolling, just a small shift, like someone adjusting their weight. I turned around. It was facing me now. I know I'd walked around it. I know it had been facing the other direction. I didn't run, but I walked fast. I pulled the door shut behind me and went straight down to the security office. I told them what I'd seen, and 2 guards went up with me to check. The door was closed and locked. 3 walked through together. The wheelchair was gone. The doorstop was sitting on the floor just inside the entrance, like it had been kicked aside. One of the guards said the old ward had a reputation. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. I stopped checking the 4th floor after midnight. If a call came in, I'd handle it, but I didn't do casual rounds up there anymore. The door kept opening, maintenance installed, a new lock, then a deadbolt. It didn't matter. On my last week before I switched to a different job, I was cleaning out my locker and found a folded piece of paper tucked into my jacket pocket. I didn't recognize it. It was a page torn from that old clipboard, a patient name and room number written in faded blue ink. I never went back to check what room it was. My brother Jake and I used to drive up to our grandfather's property in southwestern Virginia every few months to check on the place. He'd passed away 2 years earlier, and the land was just sitting there while the estate got sorted out. It was about 40 acres, most of it wooded, with an old farmhouse that hadn't been updated since the 70s. We'd usually spend the weekend clearing brush, checking for leaks, making sure squatters or vandals hadn't gotten in. It was tedious work, but it was also an excuse to get away from everything for a couple days. This was October 2018. Jake had just gone through a rough breakup, and I'd been dealing with some work stress, so we decided to make it a longer trip. We packed enough supplies for 4 days, loaded up his truck, and drove out Friday afternoon. The house was in decent shape when we arrived. A few shingles had blown off the roof, and there was a wasp nest near the back porch, but nothing major. We spent Saturday cleaning, making small repairs, and hauling trash to the burn pile. By evening, we were exhausted. We made dinner, had a few beers, and were asleep by 10. I woke up around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom. The house was completely dark. No ambient light since we were miles from anything. I used my phone as a flashlight and was halfway back to my room when I noticed the front door was open. Not wide open, but cracked about 6 inches. I walked over and looked outside. The porch light was off, and I couldn't see much beyond the first few feet of the driveway. I assumed the latch hadn't caught properly when we'd locked it earlier. I closed it firmly, checked the deadbolt, and went back to bed. In the morning, Jake was already in the kitchen making coffee. He looked like he hadn't slept well. When I asked if he was okay, he said he'd woken up sometime during the night and thought he heard someone walking around outside. He'd looked out his window but didn't see anything. I mentioned the door being open. He frowned and said he definitely locked it before bed. Even tested it twice because he was paranoid about animals getting in. We checked the door frame in the daylight. No signs of forced entry. No scratches or damage to the lock. We decided maybe the latch was just worn out and made a note to replace it. Sunday was uneventful. We worked on clearing a section of fence line, burned the brush pile, and spent the evening on the porch. Around 10, we locked up and went to bed. I made a point to check the front door myself, turning the deadbolt and pulling on the handle to make sure it was secure. I woke up around 2 a.m. The front door was open again. This time it was about a foot open, wide enough that cold air was coming in. I got up, walked over, and stood in the doorway looking out. The moon was bright enough that I could see the yard clearly. Nothing moved. No animals, no people, just stillness. I closed the door, locked it, and this time I pushed one of the kitchen chairs in front of it, wedging the back under the handle. If someone tried to open it, the chair would scrape across the floor and wake us up. I went back to my room, but didn't sleep. I lay there listening, and around 4 a.m. I heard it, a slow, steady knocking on the back door. Not loud, just 3 soft knocks, then silence, then 3 more. I got up and walked to Jake's room. He was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed. He whispered, "You hear that?" We both went to the back door. It was still locked. The knocking had stopped. Jake turned on the porch light, and we looked through the window. There was no one there. But in the dirt, just below the steps, there were footprints. Bare feet, adult-sized, starting at the tree line and walking right up to the door. Then they stopped. No prints leading away. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. We sat in the kitchen with the lights on, waiting for sunrise. When it was finally light enough, we went outside and followed the prints back into the woods. They went about 50 yards, weaving between trees, then stopped at a small clearing. In the center was a circle of stones we'd never noticed before, and in the middle of the circle was a piece of paper held down by a rock. It was a photocopy of an old property deed. Our grandfather's name was on it, dated 1972. Someone had drawn a red X through his name and written a single word underneath: borrowed. We packed everything in under an hour and left. Jay called a real estate agent the following week and listed the property. It sold within a month to a developer who planned to clear it for new construction. I don't know if they ever built anything there. I never went back to check. I taught English at a small private school in eastern Tennessee for 6 years. It was a good job, decent kids, supportive administration. In the spring of 2017, the school organized a week-long Appalachian ecology trip for the junior class. We'd take them camping, teach them about the local environment, do some trail maintenance, and give them a break from classroom walls. I volunteered to chaperone, along with 2 other teachers and the school's outdoor education coordinator, a guy named Marcus, who'd been leading these trips for over a decade. There were 18 students total, and we'd be staying at a semi-developed campground with basic facilities about an hour north of Knoxville. The first 2 days went smoothly. The kids were engaged, the weather held, and we covered a lot of ground, both literally and academically. On the 3rd day, Marcus split us into smaller groups for a trail maintenance project. I took 6 students to work on a section about 2 miles from the main camp. We were clearing fallen branches and reinforcing a washed-out section of trail when one of the students, a quiet kid named Ethan, came back from collecting brush and said he'd found something weird. He led us about 30 yards off the trail to a small hollow where someone had built a structure. It wasn't a shelter exactly, more like a frame. 4 posts driven into the ground with crossbeams, forming a perfect square about 6 feet on each side. Hanging from the crossbeams were dozens of small objects: keys, coins, buttons, a few pieces of jewelry, and scraps of paper tied with string. The students thought it was interesting, maybe some kind of art installation. I didn't like it. Something about the arrangement felt too deliberate, too private. I told them we should leave it alone and get back to work. Most of them listened, but I noticed Ethan lingering behind, looking at the objects. When we returned to camp that evening, I mentioned it to Marcus. He got very still, then asked exactly where we'd been. When I described the location, he nodded slowly and said we needed to go back first thing in the morning. We hiked out at dawn, just Marcus and me. The structure was still there, but the objects had been rearranged. They were now hanging in a different pattern, almost like they'd been sorted. Marcus walked around it once, then crouched down and started looking at the ground. He pointed to a small piece of paper that had fallen near one of the posts. It was old, the edges torn, and written on it in pencil was, "Safe Travel, MH 2009. He picked up another one, Good Health, DR 2012. He explained that this was an exchange site. People in rural Appalachia sometimes left offerings in specific places, asking for protection or luck. In return, they take something small from their life, something personal, and leave it behind as payment. He said the practice went back generations, and most sites were known only to locals. Outsiders weren't supposed to find them, and they definitely weren't supposed to take anything. I felt my stomach drop. I asked if any of the students could have taken something. Marcus said if they did, they needed to return it immediately. We gathered everyone after breakfast, and I carefully explained what the structure was and why it was important not to disturb it. Most of the kids looked confused or mildly interested, but Ethan went pale. He pulled a small brass key from his pocket. He said he thought it looked cool and figured no one would miss it, since there were so many things hanging there. Marcus asked him to show him the key. It was old, probably early 1900s, with a worn circular head. Marcus turned it over and pointed to a tiny engraving, EH. He told Ethan he needed to return it right now. We packed up and hiked back to the site immediately, all of us. When we arrived, Marcus had Ethan hang the key back where he'd found it, or at least where he thought he'd found it. Then Marcus pulled a small pocket knife from his bag, whispered something I couldn't hear, and placed it on the ground inside the structure. He said it was his exchange to balance what had been taken. We left, and I thought that was the end of it. That night, Ethan didn't come to the campfire. Another teacher checked his tent and found him sitting inside, staring at his hands. He said he felt wrong, like something was pressing on his chest. We called his parents, and they drove up the next morning to take him home early. He said he felt better once he left the campground. On our last night, Marcus and I stayed up late, making sure everything was packed and ready. Around midnight, we heard singing. It was faint, coming from somewhere in the woods. A woman's voice. The melody was old, something folk-like, but we couldn't make out the words. Marcus stood up, listened for a moment, then said, "She knows we're leaving." He didn't explain who she was. The singing stopped around 1 a.m. When we packed up the next morning, Marcus walked back to the exchange site one more time. When he returned, he said the knife he'd left was gone, and in its place was a small bundle of dried herbs tied with twine. He put it in his truck and never mentioned it again. I asked him about it a few months later, and he just said, "Some places have rules. You follow them, and they'll leave you alone." I never chaperoned that trip again.